Hi there, I am glad that you are joining me on the second video of the series for our module. During the previous video, we discussed about biology as it relates to life. In this video in particular, we focus on various aspects of science. So why don't we get started without any further delays? So as I just mentioned, biology was defined as a scientific study of life. What we see here is a reminder that there are many different fields of science, such as astronomy, biology, computer science, geology, logic, physics, chemistry, mathematics, and several others. So what is science then? Well, the term science comes from a Latin word scienza. This means, as a direct translation, knowledge. So really what happens when we do science is that we try to build up knowledge. And this can happen in a few different ways. General laws include, for example, the laws of physics. You can think of, for example, Isaac Newton and his work here. General principles instead include, for example, the rules that we apply in calculus and other fields of mathematics. The person that comes to mind as an example of this would be Greek Pythagoras of Samos, who of course is behind the Pythagorean theorem. So now that we know this, how would we go about doing science? Well, for this, we would use a specific method of research known as scientific method. And we will review the process of scientific method, looking at it as a step-by-step process in just a little while. But before we do that, let's continue with this discussion of doing science just a little further. So I'm a scientist by my real profession. So what do I do? Well, the ultimate goal of my job is to try to acquire more information about life, or if you prefer, about the world, through using a carefully controlled methodology. So since I do cardiac clinical imaging research, I don't just get to pick at random my experiments and how they are conducted in hopes of just randomly landing on something interesting as a finding. Instead, to be a scientist, it is important that I follow a carefully defined methodology, which dictates everything possible, from possible research questions to how to formulate them, to how to execute studies and report any findings so that this new knowledge is available to be evaluated and to be used by my peers in this field to advance their research on this topic. I also think that since we are looking at a class that is delivered by science department in our college, we should probably think about what unique characteristics these fields of science have. So we deliver these classes in both physical science and life science, and the latter, of course, is known as biology. They both fall under natural sciences. So natural sciences look at physical world and things that happen in it. Natural sciences are sometimes referred as hard sciences, which aims to make a point that these are often more objective and clear-cut, measurable in nature. Well, what would be a science that is not considered as a hard science? Social sciences are a good example of this. These look at human behavior in its social and cultural aspects. It seems to me that these fields leave a little more room for subjectivity, and answers are not always as clear-cut, but remain a bit more ambiguous. So let's focus on these natural sciences a little more. And just to recap what I said already earlier, natural sciences could be divided into two. While the field of physical sciences looks at non-living things like chemistry and physics, the life sciences looks at living things and life at large. So we remember from our very first video that there was, of course, biology. And that's what we are going to do on this course. I just think that it is important that we now have an idea where this course fits in this larger scheme of things. I do want to throw in this fact here too, that sometimes there are fields that overlap between these two. For example, biochemistry, which deals with both physical chemistry and living organisms. So these groups are always somewhat artificial in my view, but still useful. Okay, let's see now. We find ourselves again on this slide, so it must be an important one. Well, as we remember, biology was all about the study of life. As you will very soon find out when you start to study biology, that this is not just one single field, but rather it is made of many different specialties. And actually, I decided to challenge myself and try to list as many different branches of biology as I could, and this is how far I got. I am sure that there are a few others that I could have added, but I was quite happy with this list. But as varied as these are, all these specialties of biology share something in common. They all, being sciences, share a desire for knowledge. Remember, science was all about working towards building up knowledge. Well done for sticking with me this far. I know that this is a rather theoretical, but what we cover here forms the very foundation of the framework that we use to study life, so to study biology. Next, I want to discuss with you a little bit about two types of reasoning processes that one might use to end up with a conclusion, and also to evaluate how true the conclusion that they end up with might be. These two reasoning types are known as deductive and inductive reasoning strategies, and how they differ at large is based on the approach that they take towards the general, larger theoretical framework versus specific individual case observations. So in this visual description that I have provided, please note that the theory level is shown at the top of the pyramid, while the individual case observations are at the bottom of the pyramid. This is not to say that one would be better or higher value than the other, simply that there is a relationship between the two. You can consider them as the two different extremes of looking at some scientific phenomena. So let's start by looking at the deductive reasoning in more detail. Here, an individual starts with a general idea of a few general ideas, often called as premises. These general ideas are applied to a specific situation. So in other words, we come with a conclusion regarding a specific situation based on the general theory. I think that it is useful to define this approach through an example. Let's say that our general idea or general theory is that all muscles are made out of a living tissue. This is something that is generally well accepted, a larger concept. We just know it to be true, and it is a very wide level statement. If you wish, a big overarching umbrella kind of a fact. This statement is on a highest level of our graph here. Then the middle level of our diagram would be a statement that all humans have muscles. Again, we know this to be true. It is not quite as large level of knowledge as the one before, nor is it very specific fact. Instead, it is somewhere in between these two. Now, by using these two statements and their relationship between each other, we can guide ourselves to a conclusion about something very specific. See how we go from general to specific. So to return to our example that we started just earlier, we can now come into a conclusion. Since all muscles are made of living tissue and all humans have muscles, we can conclude that therefore all humans are made out of living tissue. Can you see how we used a very general knowledge, in this case something that has been commonly accepted as a fundamental theoretical background about human biology? And we used it to come up with conclusion about something very specific, in this case about what human is made of. And this was, of course, living tissues. So this was our deductive reasoning. It is often described as a top-down logic because it progresses from higher level general theory considered to be on the top into drawing conclusions about individual, therefore considered to be heading down. Let's look at now inductive reasoning, and while we are looking at it, try to compare it to the approach that we just saw. In this case, we look at very specific individual observations about life and use them to draw larger conclusions about larger concepts, such as formulating an all-compassing theory. Again, I think that it helps to demonstrate this through an example, so let's try to do just that. And remember that this time we will start with a specific observation or a series of specific observations. The example that I could think of would be, my neighbor's cat hisses at me daily. This statement is something that we have observed to be true on several occasions. Do note, however, that we are only talking about one specific cat and its behavior towards only one specific individual, me. Now we are ready to move from a specific observation towards something more general. Albeit, it may not be the whole word encompassing statement. Let's do just this on this example of ours. And we will say that at the pet store, all the cats hisses at me. So see how this is a statement that is more general than the initial single observation that we started with. Yet it is not an all-encompassing statement about the entire world. Instead, it is somewhere in between the two. I think that we are now ready to draw a general conclusion based on this specific observation and a more general series of observations. Why won't we do just that? And we end up with a following statement for our example. Since my neighbor's cat hisses at me daily, and at the pet store all the cats hiss at me, we can conclude that therefore all cats probably hate me. Can you see how we have gone from one single specific individual observation through a bit more general series of observations into drawing a general theory level statement about the matter? So therefore, because we progress from specific individual observations from the bottom of this diagrammatic representation to the general broad conclusion shown at the top, almost like a higher level umbrella statement of a large theory. This is why we sometimes see inductive reasoning referred as bottom-up logic. How do we feel about these two? If you are still confused, I have provided a great handout from another community college from Tennessee. For those who want to take this kind of a thinking further and consider that, of course, either one of these kinds of thinking processes have a chance to lead us to a miss. This handout also illustrates examples of that particularly well. However, you are not required to take this topic that far, just yet on this level of our courses. So just stick to the basics. I do want to take a quick advertorial break here because anyone that knows me knows that I love cats, especially kittens. So while the latter example that I picked may suggest otherwise, I think that we all should be nice about cats and nice to cats. Another division that we use when describing research is classification into qualitative and quantitative studies. And I want to start by emphasizing that both are important and useful methods, but they are used for gaining very much a different kind of knowledge. And in the next few slides, I have summarized just a few of the most important characteristics of each approach. I want us to focus on the definition for each, qualitative and quantitative. And then we will consider if numbers can be used to classify the data collected in each type. And finally, I want us to look at some examples of the type of data that is ideal for both quantitative and qualitative. So let's go through these aspects for both. Let's start by looking at the qualitative data and qualitative research. So what stands out from these qualitative data is that fact that we are looking at something that cannot be measured or expressed in numbers. These qualitative approaches are more commonly looking at things in their natural setting. Methods for gaining information in a qualitative research approach are, for example, various observations, interviews that are commonly fairly unstructured and contain open-ended questions, various different focus groups, personal experiences of a person being interviewed, and even analyzing different objects or documents. So I would describe these approaches as fairly subjective, as the researcher has to be actively involved and appreciative of the subjective nature of the subject. These approaches are very good, though, for getting a deeper level of understanding, picking subtle and complex issues, and reflecting the topics in their natural environment. Quantitative research, then again, is all about things that we can measure. This means that we can count, draw comparisons of ratios, and put things in order. So all about working with numbers. Examples of a typical quantitative research would be experiments that are conducted in a lab setting. This way we are able to often remove many confounding factors and keep the recorded data very clean. It usually fits to the measures or groups that we expect. For that reason, quantitative approaches are considered more objective and easier to have the experiments repeated. Also, sample sizes are usually much larger. I also want to mention that these methods allow us to either confirm or reject hypotheses. Some of the downsides of the quantitative research are related to the fact that since these experiments are usually conducted in the lab setting, they are not as well generalized into the real world. Also, a lot of quantitative data collection is already defined before the experiment starts. And it is difficult, if not impossible, to change or expand the answer collection approaches in the middle of an experiment. This is in stark contrast to the qualitative approaches. While this is a fairly general description of the two, the main take-home message that I want you to have is that qualitative data is descriptive, non-numerical, and from real-world setting, while quantitative data is numeric, more objective, and allows either supporting or rejecting hypotheses, typically collected in a lab experiment, but less useful for describing a real-world setting. Here I have provided a little bit larger list of comparing and contrasting the two, as I got a little carried away when thinking of the differences between the two. I expect to include this into one of your homework questions, so you do not need to memorize it. It's rather to get a large general idea of the differences between qualitative and quantitative data. You might remember that I mentioned that my background is in medical imaging research. So what I do is to look at the tissue properties of the heart tissue, in particular myocardium, using methods to quantify the magnetic resonance property of each part of the image that we produce. So really, although they look pretty and colorful, those pictures that you see here are nothing but each pixel representing a certain numeric value. And then my research compares those numeric values in the different parts of the myocardium depending on whether it is healthy or damaged by an infarction. So with all that having been said, what do you think? Is my research more qualitative or quantitative? Well, this is a question where it is easy to get misled by the fact that the pictures are pretty and colorful, but still at the end of the day, this is all quantitative research. I look at numbers. These numbers are clear, well produced by multiple measurements, consistent in patient's anatomy, so very objective. Either the heart muscle is healthy or damaged, and the number tells us that. Let's have a look at a few little easier ones. So here I have two scenarios for you to read. Which type do you think each one to be? Qualitative or quantitative? Well, here we see that the statement where I talk about measuring heart rate from 100 subjects and then coming up with a statement that an average heart rate in this is this and that. This statement is of course more quantitative. We are measuring something. So the answer that we end up with is numeric. A statement where I describe the behavior of monkeys in wild and end up drawing conclusion about their social hierarchies, this is definitely more descriptive in nature. So this means that it is a qualitative one. I hope that this difference makes sense to you now. Now we are ready to move on to look at another important theme. We will be next discussing about scientific method and what it is and how it works. And I wanted to start with this picture so that we have a little background on how this method came about in history. Sir Francis Bacon is typically credited for being the first to define the scientific method. It has characterized the development of the science since 17th century. It involves clearly defined steps that are followed in a careful manner, rigorously evaluating what is being observed and striving towards ultimate objectivity. So here I have what I think is a rather nice definition of the scientific method. Scientific method being a process where the question of interest is formulated so that it is clear and unambiguous. And then this question is tested using a well-established systematic approach which removes much of the subjectivity. So as I said, this is a multi-step process. The number of steps varies depending on who you ask from, which gives in the end a clear answer whether the hypothesis that we formulated is supported or not. And then we must do something with this finding. So why don't we have a look at these steps as the next thing that we do? We always start with either some sort of an observation that we make about the world around us, or we might have some previous knowledge which shapes our thought process on what we are interested in. So for an example that I will be using, let's say that we have noticed that there is a certain pattern that we have noticed in how monkeys behave when eating. However, we cannot be sure if this is just a coincidence or if there is more to it. So this is going to become our interest, right? Well, what we do next is that we want to come up with a question that our research will tackle using scientific method. This question is a fairly general in nature, and we will work a little more on it at the later steps of the process, but it usually is a good starting point to give us a direction on what we are interested in looking at. In our examples of monkeys, let's say that I am, as a researcher who has spent a lot of time in the wild with the monkeys, interested about monkeys' eating behaviors. Is there a preferred way for a monkey to eat a banana? Well, before I move further, I take the question that we formulated earlier and make it into a hypothesis. And if you have not heard before or do not remember what hypothesis is, it is a tentative explanation of something that we are studying. We use our hypothesis as a foundation for all that we do in the next steps of the study. A good hypothesis is very specific. It avoids being too general in nature. Importantly, it must be something that is testable. It must be possible to test this hypothesis. And furthermore, the test that we conduct, it should give us a clear answer, one way or another. So really, our experiment that we conduct by using scientific method, it aims to either confirm or reject the hypothesis that we created at this stage. This is why taking some time to formulate a good hypothesis is important. Let's say that in our example of monkeys eating bananas, I say that my hypothesis is something along the lines. If there is an end of a banana that monkeys favor when eating those bananas, then we will see this being the end that most monkeys open first, because eating the banana in this way is easier and more efficient and cleaner and safer, or something else. I do want to say at this point that I am by no means an expert of monkeys or eating bananas, so I'm just coming up with this at this example. Okay, the next step for us to consider is that based on the hypothesis, the tentative explanation of what we want to study, we can formulate a prediction of what we expect to happen. Let's say that we decide that in our example of monkeys always open a banana from the distal end. This means from the end that is further from where it was attached to the tree. Some could call this a bottom end of a banana. So now we have made a prediction that there is one end that is preferred, and we have specified what end it is. Now we are ready to conduct the experiment, which aims to answer our question by either confirming or rejecting our hypothesis and either agreeing or disagreeing with our prediction. It is important that an experiment is controlled. We want to be sure that the setting and the method that we use is consistent, so that we can be confident that what we are finding is due to the thing that we are interested in, not because some other external factor. One way to insert this is by using different groups, and this is actually often what is done in experiments that follow good scientific method. You might remember drug trials where some of the patients receive the real drug and some patients receive ineffective fake drug known as placebo. Well, in our monkey experiment, I think that a good way to do this would be by giving the monkeys in one group the banana one way, while the monkeys that are in another test group receive the banana as being offered first the opposite end to that what we saw earlier. Or we could even add a third group where the monkeys are free to take the banana themselves. It is not offered in a manner where a particular end is first given. At this point, we are watching these monkeys as we are running the experiment. And experiment that is conducted following scientific method gives us some kind of data. We are recording or telling up what we are witnessing in our experiment. In the case of our monkeys, every time that a monkey starts to eat a new banana, we make a note or record of which end of the banana that monkey first opens. Proximal or distal, or in other words, top or bottom. And then we just keep tallying up this information as we conduct the experiment. Of course, we could be recording many other factors as well, like how fast the monkey ate the banana, how much waste there was left, how much did the monkey enjoy the banana, or I don't know how you would measure the enjoyment, but a lot of things that we could see and record. Okay, now that we have run an experiment, recorded data, it is time to do something with that data. Let's tally up our results and do some mathematics, say statistics, to compare our results between the groups. Let's run a simple t-test. This is statistical test comparing groups, trying to find if there is a significant difference, a difference that we can be certain to be due to the factor that we are studying, not just taking place by random chance. So what is important here is that the results that we get here simply state the outcome. They do not start to give reasons or explanations of this, just saying that this is numerically what we found. Again, let's look at our experiment on monkeys' eating habits. I am going to guess here and say that our experiment finds that most of the monkeys opened the banana from its bottom end. I call this the distal end. And we might also notice that those monkeys that did it in this way were quicker to finish enjoying their banana. And for the heck of it, let's also say that they wasted less of the edible banana when eating in this way. So a lot of data that indicates that the bottom or distal end is preferred. At this point of the process, we have already done a lot. We started with some initial observations or knowledge. We formulated a question that we were interested in. Then, based on that question, we came up with hypotheses that was specific, not too general, plausible to test, and will give us a clear answer. After that, we predicted the outcome by using the hypotheses that we had formulated. We conducted a controlled experiment, in this case using different groups or conditions, if you wish. We got our data from which we were able to pull results. And now, after all these steps, we are ready to draw our conclusions on our experiment. This stage is important, as now, instead of just telling what numbers said, we give reason for why it is what we saw. We get to explain our findings. And jumping back to our example of the monkey's preferred method of eating banana, let's say that we found out that majority of monkeys prefer to open the banana from its bottom distal end, regardless of how the banana was handed or made available to them. This seems to be because it was quicker and required less effort to open the banana from this end. We also observed that monkeys who ate the banana by starting from this end wasted less of the edible flesh of the banana. Overall, eating bananas by starting from the bottom distal end seemed to be by far more favored and resulting in an outcome that was more beneficial for the monkeys. Now that was quite a conclusion, wasn't it? We are still not finished yet. The next step in our scientific process is to look back to our original hypothesis and ask ourselves, did our findings support the hypothesis that we set? Does our study confirm or reject the hypothesis? Remember, the hypothesis was set in the start, and after it was set, we no longer can go back and change it. It is what it is, and we are testing it. So if we find at this point that the findings from our experiments did not support the hypothesis, we might wish to go back there and reformulate them, or restructure the experiment, or change something. And if the hypothesis that we set at the very start of the scientific process is supported by our findings from our experiment, well, then this is the moment when the researchers are usually pretty darn happy and feel a good publication and fame and recognition heading their way. But just having conducted this amazing experiment alone is not all that we want. When you do well, what do you want to do? You want to tell everyone about it, right? So we want to share our findings with the world, and especially with the scientific world. and with the people who work in the same field. So sharing your findings becomes important. And you can do this through peer-reviewed journal publications or by going to a conference to present your findings and so on. The important thing is to get the word out there about what you found. And likely, those who are working on the same field as you are working on, those will be very observant and read and evaluate your findings carefully. This works as a control mechanism too, to make sure that what is published is correct and accurate. So again, in our example of the monkey's behavior when eating bananas, you might publish in some sort of behavioral biology of the apes journal or go to some monkey conference. There is an audience to almost any special niche of the biology, it seems. Finally, if you are very lucky and your findings reveal something crucial new information, or it may be that they even just confirm what has been earlier found out, there is a good chance that your research starts to contribute to the larger construction of the body of knowledge in this field. Your findings can even change our view of the world as it is. This is when they become part of the theory. Who knows, you might have just helped to shape our larger general understanding of monkeys and their social behavior and eating habits. This kind of theory can then again become very useful later, say in conservation efforts of monkeys as an example. So there you have it, our graph highlighting different steps of the scientific process. And this is going to be a great time for us to stop on this video, I think. We will continue a little more in the next video where we will look at the topics like definition of life. I know that this was a lot of information, but this forms the foundation of what we build upon throughout the course. So I really want to make sure that we are all in the same place with our understanding of these concepts. I am going to wrap up this video here and say a massive thank you for having joined me on this one. I will see you again very soon.